Izuku and Himiko. One last Valentine's Day. What is it that makes someone a villain? Their ideals, their way of thinking, perhaps their personality? The answer isn't simple, but at the same time, it is experience. A child might grow up believing that the world is fair, that everything will be easy if they just work hard and follow the rules. But reality is brutal and unforgiving. And when that truth hits with its full force, it can either shatter everything one once believed, or mold them into something new. Often, that painful experience becomes the breaking point that pushes a person toward darkness. The pain, the frustration, and the helplessness of facing a world that refuses to meet expectations can open a void inside oneself. It's in that moment when the decision of how to respond to adversity becomes a turning point in someone's life. One can choose to cling to hope and kindness, or they can give in to resentment, despair, and the desire for revenge. A villain isn't born from nothing. They are shaped by the accumulation of small yet meaningful experiences that transform them into what they become. For Izuku Midoriya, reality came in the form of betrayal, abandonment, and a broken promise. He had worked and trained his body, dedicating himself completely to a single purpose, only to have fate rip that dream from his hands with a cruelty he couldn't understand. That was the moment he lost his way as a hero. That was the moment he realized that the path of light was not for him. Now, years later, Izuku Midoriya was seated in a luxurious private restaurant, at the center of an elegant table for two. Across from him, with a glass of wine in her hand and a feline smile on her lips, was his wife, Himiko Midoriya. The restaurant was a spectacle of opulence. Crystal chandeliers reflected the soft golden light, classic decor in deep red hues adorned the walls, and velvet curtains framed the windows. However, the contrast was grotesque. Around them, the floor was littered with lifeless bodies. Some were breathing faintly, others weren't. The metallic scent of blood lingered in the air, mixing with the aroma of wine and gourmet food. Himiko gazed at the moon through the shattered window, tracing circles along the rim of her wine glass with her index finger. "Tell me, do you ever regret choosing this life?" she asked calmly, her soft voice betraying her desire to know his answer. Her blonde hair was swept to one side, revealing her pale and delicate neck. Her red dress, fitted to her slender figure, bore fresh bloodstains that stood out like dark roses. Izuku, sitting across from her, met her gaze with those piercing green eyes that had lost their innocent glow long ago. His black hair was slightly tousled, and a light beard framed his sharp jawline. His athletic build and commanding aura made him look like a king ruling the world. "No," Izuku narrowed his eyes, his deep voice steady. "My actions were justified, and I wouldn't change a thing. Most of all, because being by your side has been the best thing that's ever happened to me." Himiko smiled dangerously, a hint of a fang peeking from the corner of her mouth. She extended her hand and took his with surprising tenderness. That answer made her happy. She had always held that small fear that he might regret being with her. "Happy anniversary, and happy Valentine's Day, my love." Izuku intertwined his fingers with hers and smiled tenderly, with the same love that had once been his salvation, the same love that had pulled her from her own darkness. He had to admit, though, that she still carried a touch of madness, but that madness was exclusively for him, born from the love she felt for him. Himiko loved the way he looked at her, not as a woman lost in her own insanity, but as his wife, the woman he had chosen to love. "Happy Valentine's Day, my crimson princess," he said, provoking a small smile from her. He knew how much she liked that nickname. He rose from his seat and walked toward her, leaning down behind Himiko to caress her neck and embrace her. His lips brushed against her ear. "Until the end, right?" Himiko closed her eyes and leaned into his chest, longing for more time, but knowing the world would never allow it. She smiled, feeling at peace. "Until the end, together." Through the restaurant's shattered window, the silver light of the full moon illuminated a chilling scene. Outside, in the streets, a massive legion of heroes was gathering, all ready to attack the couple. Dozens upon dozens of the most powerful and feared heroes in the world, accompanied not only by elite troops but also by tanks and military helicopters strategically positioned, hovering above the area and projecting blinding lights directly onto the restaurant. The global army, composed of countless heroes, was prepared to put an end once and for all to the greatest villains in history. Himiko slowly opened her eyes, her gaze as cold as steel as she observed the scene beyond the window. "Well, it looks like they're taking us seriously this time," she murmured calmly, as if what she saw didn't surprise her in the slightest. Izuku let out a soft, almost mocking laugh. "About time," he replied, his tone filled with a mix of defiance and acceptance, as though the arrival of this moment had always been inevitable. With a swift motion, Izuku grabbed the table in front of them and hurled it straight toward the window, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. The glass exploded into a shower of sharp fragments that flew toward the heroes outside. Himiko stood up with elegance and drew 2 knives hidden in the garters around her thighs. The silver blades reflected the moonlight as she twisted her wrists with deadly precision. "Maybe this is our last day. But it'll be our last day together," she said as red flashes lit up her eyes, preparing for the massacre. Izuku smiled and activated his quirks. A dense, dark aura surrounded his body as white lightning surged from him, illuminating the air around them. Together until the end. Both of them launched forward at the same time. Himiko twisted in midair and hurled her knife straight toward the heads of 2 heroes, who barely had time to react. Izuku, meanwhile, struck the ground with devastating force, creating a shockwave that sent the nearby heroes flying through the air. In the distance, screams and gunfire could be heard. But for Izuku and Himiko, the sound of chaos was nothing more than background music. "Come on, my love," Himiko said, spinning through the air and dodging hundreds of bullets aimed at her, only to land gracefully on the ground like a dancer. "Let's have some fun." Izuku smiled as his dark aura pulsed with intensity. "I'll keep up with you." Together, they charged toward the battlefield once again, knowing this would be their last night. But to understand this moment, we need to see what happened before. Flashback, many years ago. It all began with their birth, Izuku and his brother. Inko Midoriya, with a smile full of love and tenderness, cradled 2 tiny babies in her arms. They were Izuku and Reiju Midoriya. Reiju, with his bright green hair, resembled her, while Izuku, with his darker green hair, looked equally perfect. Both so small, so innocent, they were perfect. Inko gazed at them with deep love, feeling immense gratitude for the life she had brought into the world. From the beginning, Inko's life hadn't been easy, especially after her husband left her. But 3 years after the birth of her twins, something unexpected happened. She met Toshinori Yagi, a man full of kindness and light, and soon they began a new chapter together. Love grew quickly between them, and Inko's life took an unexpected turn, giving way to a united and happy family. It was a quiet afternoon when Toshinori, dressed in a simple t-shirt and wearing that kind smile he was known for, knelt in front of the babies. He watched them tenderly, placing a hand over the small heads of Izuku and Reiju. "Izuku, Reiju," he said with a deep, warm voice. "Someday, one of you will inherit my power." Those words filled the air, heavy with promise and expectation. Inko watched them, surprised and excited. She already knew about One for All, but at that moment she realized that her children's future would be something truly extraordinary. Toshinori wasn't just offering them power, he was offering them a legacy, an opportunity to carry on with strength beyond imagination. The eyes of Izuku and Reiju shone with admiration as they looked at their father. Toshinori smiled warmly at them. "But there is a condition," Toshinori said with a serious expression. "The one who trains the hardest, the one who proves to be worthy, will be the one to inherit my power." Izuku looked at Reiju, and Reiju returned his gaze. In that instant, the rivalry was sealed in their hearts, even though neither of them could have imagined that such a simple decision would end up changing everything in the future. Izuku clenched his fists. "I'll be the best, Dad." Reiju smiled confidently. "I won't let you beat me, Izuku." Toshinori looked at them with pride and ruffled their hair. "Then, give me your best effort." Izuku and Reiju exchanged looks, their eyes filled with determination. Reiju was the first to smile confidently, crossing his arms over his chest. "I'm going to be the best," Reiju said, with a defiant spark in his green eyes. "I'm going to train harder than anyone, Dad." Izuku furrowed his brow and clenched his fists, feeling a pressure in his chest that he didn't quite understand. "I'll be strong too," he exclaimed, stepping forward. "I'm going to be the best hero, you'll see." Toshinori smiled warmly and placed a hand on their heads. "Then show me what you're capable of." Izuku looked at his brother with a mix of rivalry and admiration. He knew Reiju was strong, even at such a young age, but he would be strong too. He wouldn't let himself fall behind. From that day on, the rivalry between the Midoriya brothers was sealed as a silent pact. Every day was a battle. Every glance was a challenge. And every defeat was a reminder that only one of them could be worthy of Toshinori's power. The first blow for Izuku came a year later. Reiju was 5 years old when his quirk awakened. A burst of electricity enveloped his body like a raging storm, lighting up the Midoriya living room with a blinding yellow glow. The ceiling lamp shattered into 1,000 pieces. "Mom, Dad. Look at this!" Reiju exclaimed, smiling excitedly as a bolt of lightning crackled between his fingers. Toshinori immediately stood up, shocked and excited. "Incredible!" Inko rushed toward Reiju, kneeling in front of him and gently holding his small hands. "Honey, that's amazing. You have an incredible quirk." Toshinori laughed as he lifted Reiju into his arms. "An electricity-based quirk. This is amazing, Reiju." Izuku, sitting on the couch with a notebook in his hands, watched the scene with his heart painfully pounding. I probably have an incredible quirk too," he murmured, standing up slowly. "Maybe I have a quirk too." But when he went to the hospital to have his quirk checked, the doctor's words hit him like a cold knife straight to the chest: "You don't have a quirk." Izuku looked at his parents, searching for an explanation, an answer that never came. "I'm very sorry, Izuku," said the doctor, with a serious expression. "We didn't find any quirk manifestation in your DNA." Izuku felt the world closing in on him. His hands trembled, and his breathing quickened. "But, that's impossible, Ann." Inko took his hands, her expression sad. "Izuku, there are ways to be strong, even without a quirk." But Izuku could barely hear her. His eyes were fixed on Reiju, who was playing with the sparks at his fingertips while Toshinori gave him instructions on how to control it. "Reiju, you're amazing!" Toshinori exclaimed, laughing as Reiju released small electric discharges from his hand, shaping them. His mother didn't take long to leave Izuku's side and join them, smiling proudly at her son. "You're going to be incredible in the future," Inko said cheerfully. However, all the excitement left Izuku with a strange feeling in his chest. "Dad, did you see that?" Reiju exclaimed, laughing with excitement, unaware of how his brother was feeling. "I saw it, son," Toshinori said as he hugged Reiju tightly, his smile full of pride. "I'm so proud of you." Izuku clenched his fists, feeling his heart twist painfully. His father's words, filled with pride for Reiju, hit him hard. A hollow, burning sensation began to form in his chest, and his eyes glistened with restrained tears. While the praise for Reiju continued, Inko noticed Izuku's sadness and quickly approached him, kneeling down to hug him. "Izuku, honey, it's okay. You don't need a quirk to be strong. You're special, you're just not special." Izuku muttered, pulling away from her with an empty expression. "If I don't have a quirk, I'm not special. That's what you're trying to say, right?" Inko opened her mouth, but she couldn't find the right words to comfort him. Izuku didn't wait for an answer and walked toward the door of the clinic, feeling the crushing weight of emptiness with every step he took. After that day, Izuku trained like a madman. He developed his body until his muscles were firm and defined, impressive for his young age. He jumped rope, did push-ups, and ran until his legs burned and his breathing turned ragged. But even so, it wasn't enough. By the time he was 11, Izuku had built a trained body that rivaled that of an average adult. Yet he still lacked a quirk, which put him at a major disadvantage. Reiju, on the other hand, had perfected his quirk with seemingly little effort. The electric sparks surrounding his body were now brighter and more intense, giving him a significant boost in power. "Are you ready, little brother?" Reiju asked with a confident smile. Izuku took a deep breath and assumed a defensive stance. "I'm ready." Reiju vanished in the blink of an eye and appeared at his side in less than a second. Izuku raised his forearm to block the hit, but the impact was devastating. The lightning exploded against his skin, sending him flying several meters. His body rolled across the ground before stopping with a painful groan. Izuku gritted his teeth and pushed himself up, stumbling slightly. Reiju looked at him with a smug smile. Is that all, little brother? Izuku clenched his fists. I'm not done yet. Inko and Toshinori watched the fight from a distance. Inko clasped her hands over her chest, her expression torn between pride and worry. Toshi, they're going too far. Toshinori watched with a serious expression. This is necessary. The fight continued, and the balance remained firmly against Izuku. His breathing was labored, and his body ached with every movement, but even so, he gathered his last strength and lunged forward, aiming to land a punch on Reiju. However, his brother effortlessly dodged the attack and, in an instant, his fist crackling with electricity slammed into Izuku's stomach. The air was knocked from Izuku's lungs in a choked gasp as he collapsed to his knees, clutching his abdomen and desperately trying to catch his breath. That's enough. Toshinori said, walking toward them. He placed a hand on Reiju's shoulder, the sparks still crackling across his skin. You did well, son. Reiju smiled with satisfaction at his father's praise. Thanks, Dad. Toshinori looked down at Izuku, who was still on the ground, his breathing ragged and his hands clenched against the floor. His legs trembled as he tried to stand. Izuku, you did well. Izuku lifted his gaze, his lower lip trembling and his eyes glassy with unshed tears. His chest rose and fell with difficulty. Don't lie, he whispered, so softly that only he could hear it. Slowly, he pushed himself up, limping and clenching his teeth to keep from groaning in pain. His ragged breathing and the burning in his ribs faded in comparison to the heavy weight in his heart. He didn't look back as he walked away, unable to escape the feeling of his mother's gaze fixed on his back. Reiju stepped closer to Toshinori, smiling smugly. I think he should just give up, don't you? Toshinori frowned, clearly irritated by the comment, but chose to remain silent. Meanwhile, Izuku, wounded both in body and pride, clenched his fists and walked toward his room. He needed to rest, to recover, because he knew this wasn't over. From that day on, Izuku doubled his efforts. Regular physical training was no longer enough. If his body wouldn't give him the power he needed, then he had to find another way to obtain it. Using his father's contacts, he searched for someone who could take him to the next level. And that's how he found the perfect mentor. Mirko. A heroine who, despite having debuted recently, had already made a name for herself among the best for her ferocity in combat. He had watched her fights on television. Her aggressive and ruthless style awakened something inside him. If there was anyone who could teach him how to break his limits and seize every opportunity to become stronger, it was her. So he contacted her without hesitation. They met in a private gym. Mirko looked him up and down, arms crossed and one eyebrow raised. The mocking expression on her face made his blood boil. Do you really think you're worth my time? Mirko said with a sharp smile. Izuku clenched his fists, feeling the burn in his knuckles. Give me 4 months. If I'm not worthy, I'll just give you the money and leave. Mirko clicked her tongue. TSH. 4 months, huh? Doesn't sound too bad. Her red eyes studied him intensely. What do you say, kid? Think you can survive? Izuku didn't blink. I will. Mirko smirked. I hope you have good lungs, because I'm going to break you. Training was hell. After school, Izuku would sprint to Mirko's gym at full speed. But that was only the warm-up. Mirko would strap sandbags to his shoulders and make him do push-ups, squats, and sprints until his muscles burned and his arms trembled. When that was over, the hard part began, sparring. Izuku was on his knees on the floor, panting, exhausted. Mirko showed no hint of mercy during the fight. She stood over him, hands on her hips, with an arrogant smile on her lips, like a predator about to strike. Not bad, kid. But is that all you've got? She said mockingly, gesturing with her hand for him to try again. Izuku gritted his teeth, struggling to stand, feeling the sharp pain in his muscles. Let's go again, he growled, breathing heavily as he launched himself toward her. Mirko let out a low, almost mocking laugh. That's what I like to see. 2 months passed, then 3, then 4. Izuku became faster, stronger, more resilient. But it still wasn't enough. Currently, Izuku was on his 40th fight against Mirko, and he still hadn't managed to beat her. Once again, he was lying on the ground, his hands shaking and his mouth filled with blood. The physical pain was unbearable, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was Mirko's gaze. She looked at him with a mixture of pity and seriousness, her rabbit ears tilting backward. "You lost, kid," she said dryly. "So leave and don't come back." Izuku lifted his gaze, tears burning in his eyes. "Just one more fight." Mirko shook her head, turning away. "Don't forget the money before you leave." Izuku remained on the ground, his hands pressed into the floor. Mirko walked away, but before leaving, she turned her head slightly. "If you had a quirk, you would have been the strongest," Mirko thought, shaking her head in frustration. "What a waste." Izuku lowered his head, sweat and tears falling heavily onto the floor. His body trembled, not just from physical exhaustion, but from the rage and helplessness consuming him from within. Every fiber of his being screamed for more, for something that would give him purpose, something that would make him feel like he mattered. "It doesn't matter," he whispered to himself, his voice shaky but full of determination. With effort, he stood up, his legs trembling under his own weight. "I'll be stronger, with or without a quirk." Determination burned inside him, fueled by his pain, his frustration, but also by the hope that, despite everything, he could still achieve what he dreamed of. And if he couldn't become strong through conventional means, then he would have to find another way. No matter the cost. And so, he started reaching out to other heroes. He used his father's contacts and, when that wasn't enough, he ventured into places he shouldn't have. At night, when no one was watching, he slipped into the most dangerous corners of the city, picking fights with thugs to gain experience. Izuku walked down a dark alley, his hands in the pockets of his jacket, his hood covering his face. The damp air made his breathing heavy. The alleys were covered in graffiti, broken glass, and trash. Around him, shadowy figures watched from the dark. Some murmured, others laughed. But Izuku paid them no attention. Then he heard a laugh. "Ha, ha 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 ha." The laughter was sharp, broken, accompanied by ragged breathing. Izuku frowned and walked toward the sound. What he saw left him speechless. A young girl with blonde hair and golden eyes was sitting on top of a man. Her thin hands, stained with blood, were tightly gripping the victim's neck, which was already lifeless. The girl's eyes were shining with tears, but her smile was wide and twisted. Izuku approached cautiously. "Hey," he murmured. "Let him go. He's already dead." The girl didn't react. She kept laughing, even as tears rolled down her cheeks. Izuku reached out a hand toward her shoulder to calm her, but he had to pull back quickly when she turned her head and threw a knife straight at his neck. The blade grazed his skin, leaving a thin, almost imperceptible cut. That was dangerous, Izuku thought, touching his neck and seeing the blood on his fingertips. If he had reacted a second later, he might have been dead. The girl was looking at him with a mix of joy and hatred. Her golden eyes glinted with a sick intensity. Her breathing was quick, and her pupils were dilated. Izuku slowly raised his hands. "Calm down. I don't want to fight." The girl tilted her head, a psychotic smile spreading across her face. "You don't want to fight? But I do." Without warning, she lunged at him. Izuku reacted at the last second, spinning on his heels to dodge the first attack. The knife passed so close to his cheek that he could feel the cold bite of the blade. The girl laughed excitedly, spinning on herself and throwing 3 hidden knives from her belt. Izuku dodged 2, but the third one sank deep into his thigh. "Tsk, shit." Izuku fell to his knees, teeth clenched in pain. The girl ran toward him, another knife in her hand, ready to finish him off. Izuku rolled to the side, barely avoiding the blade, and grabbed the knife embedded in his leg, pulling it out in one swift motion. Blood splattered on the ground. The girl lunged at him again, this time aiming to stab him in the head. Izuku blocked the attack with the knife he had pulled out, deflecting the blade to the side, but he felt the edge cut across the skin of his arm. Izuku twisted and pushed forward, ramming his shoulder into the girl's stomach. They both rolled across the ground, grappling with each other. Izuku ended up on top of her, pinning her wrists to the floor. "Damn it, can you calm down?" Izuku growled through gritted teeth. The girl was still smiling, her breath uneven. Then she suddenly jerked her head forward and headbutted him right in the nose. "Shit, fuck." Izuku heard the crunch of his nose and felt the warm trail of blood running down his lips. "Hee hee, pretty blood." The girl looked at him with a lascivious smile, her cheeks flushed. Now let me go, or I'll kill you. Izuku didn't let go. His breathing was heavy, and his gaze darkened. I see, you don't want to live. The girl's smile faded for an instant. Her eyes widened slightly in surprise. Izuku took the knife he had pulled from his leg and raised it. The blade gleamed under the dim light of the street. The girl's eyes widened in terror. Her whole body froze as the knife descended mercilessly toward her. For a brief moment, everything seemed to move in slow motion. Before her eyes, the figure above her resembled an omnipotent being, ready to take her life in a single blow. But she didn't want to die. She still had reasons to live. She still craved revenge against those who had pushed her into this fate. I'm sorry, she screamed, closing her eyes tightly. Izuku stopped, the blade hovering inches from her forehead. The girl's breathing was rapid and uneven. Huff. Izuku let out a breath, followed by a small laugh. Ha ha ha. The girl looked at him, confused, as if she were seeing a madman. Why are you laughing? She murmured, her voice trembling. Izuku wiped the blood from his face with his sleeve, looking at her with a tired expression. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, he said, unable to hold back the laughter escaping from his lips. It's just, you pissed me off so much. I wanted to teach you a lesson. He shrugged and tossed the knife to the side. I wasn't really going to hurt you. I'm Izuku, I hope you're feeling calmer now. The girl stared at him, her expression still full of confusion, but deep in her eyes, something was shining with curiosity, a spark that reflected an unspoken question. She still didn't understand what kind of person Izuku was. Her face was still stained with tears and someone else's blood, and the smile she had worn before was now a mixture of fury and disdain, and that fury was, in truth, directed at herself. Why? She whispered, her voice barely an echo in the silence. Why didn't you kill me? The question hung in the air, heavy with deep pain and a desperation that burned her from the inside, while her gaze drifted into the void. Izuku tilted his head, watching her calmly. Is that really what you want? She opened her mouth to answer but quickly closed her lips, looking away. Her breathing became erratic until, suddenly, she let out a bitter laugh. Do you know what I am? What I've done? Izuku shrugged. I saw enough. She let out a dry laugh, but her eyes began to water again. I'm a killer, a psychopath. I should be dead. That would be for the best. Maybe, Izuku replied, and his simple response pierced her chest like a knife. But not everything that glitters is gold, and not everything bad is truly evil. You might be crazy, but I don't think you're completely wicked. She clenched her teeth, her thoughts dragging her back to the past. They locked me up, she whispered bitterly, digging her nails into the skin of her hands. My parents locked me up after I killed my pet. Izuku watched her, listening intently, trying to understand. Your pet? She lifted her gaze, a mix of guilt and rage flickering in her eyes. Yes, my cat. I loved him so much that, when I saw him bleed, I couldn't stop myself. I needed more. I needed to see more of his blood. So I killed him. A chill ran down Izuku's spine, but he remained silent. My parents called me a monster. Tears began to stream down her face, and the bitter smile vanished. They locked me in the basement for months. They only let me out to act like a normal girl, to maintain the illusion of a perfect family. But inside, my thirst for blood kept growing. By that point, Izuku had already released her. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. In the end, I couldn't keep pretending. I lost control. I wanted to kill them, make them bleed, but I couldn't do it. So I ran away from home. I wandered the streets for weeks, until that man. Her breath hitched, and her body tensed. A dark shadow passed over her face. He wanted to hurt me. So I killed him. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it was clear that even though the man had deserved his fate, the girl was still haunted by what happened. She looked away, her eyes glistening with tears. I defended myself from him, attacked him without mercy. He deserved it, but I couldn't stop myself. I felt overwhelmed, like I couldn't control what I was doing. I wanted more. I wanted to keep seeing his blood, but then you interrupted me. Izuku remained silent, observing her carefully. The girl gritted her teeth, a faint tremor running through her body. Now you understand, right? I'm a monster. And a monster like me doesn't deserve to live, she shouted, expecting him to look at her with disgust, with fear. But she wasn't prepared for what he said next. Izuku approached her slowly. The girl watched him with suspicion but didn't back away. If you're a monster, Izuku murmured, standing very close to her, then I guess that makes two of us. Her eyes widened in shock. Izuku wrapped his arms around her thin shoulders. She stiffened at first, but then collapsed into his embrace, letting out a heartbreaking sob as the tears fell freely down her face. It's going to be okay, Izuku murmured against her hair, his voice soft, a sharp contrast to the intensity of the moment. You're not alone anymore. His hero instincts, the desire to help others, or maybe the empathy he felt upon seeing someone so vulnerable, something pushed him to protect her, to give her what she needed most in that moment, comfort and hope in the middle of the chaos that surrounded her. After that day, Izuku couldn't leave her on the street. With the money he had from his father, he managed to get her a decent apartment in a safe neighborhood. When Toga moved in, the first thing she did was hug him tightly, almost squeezing the air out of his lungs. Izuku's eye twitched when he felt something wet on his neck. Toga, he murmured, slightly annoyed by his new friend's bad habit. If you want to thank me, I'd appreciate it if you didn't try to suck my blood. Toga pulled away and wiped the trail of saliva from her mouth, smiling mischievously. You wound me, Izuku. I wasn't doing anything. Izuku sighed, rubbing his forehead. Sure. Time passed, and their friendship grew in a strange way. Izuku began to train harder, preparing himself for what he knew would be the decisive battle against his brother. Besides Toga, there was someone else who became an unexpected motivation for Izuku, Itsuka Kendo. He met her at a dojo he had gone to in order to challenge everyone there. No one was a match for him. One by one, Izuku defeated them with precision and superhuman strength. His body, trained to the limit, made him look more like a soldier than a teenager. Itsuka was the last one to face him. Her confidence was unshakable as she adjusted her combat gloves, a confident smile curling on her lips. Izuku, for his part, said nothing. He simply took his fighting stance, the one where every strike was calculated, aimed at the human body's critical points. The fight was fast and ruthless. Itsuka charged at him with ferocity, her enlarged fists searching for an opening in Izuku's defense. But he was too fast. Too strong. Too precise with every one of his movements. He dodged, blocked, and counterattacked with brutal efficiency. Every one of his strikes was meant to destabilize her, to weaken her little by little. Finally, in one smooth motion, Izuku took her down with a flawless hold. Itsuka lay on the ground, gasping, her chest rising and falling frantically as she stared at the ceiling, defeated. To her surprise, that defeated expression changed. Itsuka no longer seemed upset, instead, she smiled with excitement. You're strong. She murmured, her breath ragged. And to Izuku's surprise, she proposed something he didn't see coming. Do you want to be my friend? Izuku stared at her, surprised, but something inside him told him that, even if it was unexpected, it felt right. So he smiled at her, extending his hand to help her up, and that's how he became her friend. What started as trivial conversations turned into training sessions together. Over time, their relationship grew into something more romantic. Though Izuku was hesitant at first, he eventually accepted and even enjoyed having someone who accepted him for who he was. However, not everything was easy, especially because Toga began to get territorial. Every time Izuku went to visit Itsuka, Toga would glare at him with narrowed eyes, visibly irritated. Why are you spending so much time with her? Toga asked, puffing out her cheeks. Because she's my friend. Friend? Toga's expression darkened. Izuku sighed, stepping closer and wrapping his arms around her. Don't get jealous, Toga. She let out a sigh, relaxing slightly. But when Izuku tried to pull away, Toga clung to his neck and lightly sank her fangs into his skin. Toga. What? I'm just marking you. Izuku rubbed the bridge of his nose, resigned. Now Izuku was 14. The boy who had been defeated at 11 by his twin brother was now about to apply to UA stronger and more determined than ever. But before that, he had to face one last trial. In an open area chosen by their parents for the brothers' fight, Izuku stood in front of Reiju. His brother watched him with a confident smile, his hands in his pockets, and a crackling current of electricity surrounding his body. "You look confident, Izuku," he said calmly, as if he already knew the outcome. Izuku smiled faintly, flexing the muscles in his arms, the heat of adrenaline coursing through every fiber of his body. "I am." Reiju narrowed his eyes, his lips curling into a dangerous smile. "Good." Reiju murmured, his eyes flashing with electricity as he pulled his hands from his pockets. "Because this time, I'll prove who's the best." The air between them was charged with tension. Reiju cracked his knuckles, and a surge of electricity ran down his arm, illuminating his skin with yellow sparks. Izuku remained motionless, his dark green eyes locked onto his brother's, analyzing every movement, every breath. "Don't hold back, Reiju," Izuku said with unsettling calm. "Give me everything you've got, because I won't hold back." Reiju smiled, a crooked smile that reflected the absolute confidence he had in his victory. "Oh, I will." Toshinori watched from a distance, his face serious and his jaw tense. He knew this fight would define everything. For years, he had trained Reiju with the intent that he would become the heir to One for All, but he wasn't blind. He knew that his other son, Izuku, had been working tirelessly all these years. He knew Izuku had become stronger than he or his wife had ever imagined. And if he won, then he would pass his quirk on to him. Himiko stood beside Toshinori, her hands clasped over her chest, her knuckles white from the pressure. Her eyes were filled with guilt. Deep down, she knew Reiju would win. He had always been the prodigy. The strong one. The one destined to be the best. But seeing Izuku now, with his cold and determined expression, made her heart ache. She still remembered her little Izuku, that child who would run after her with a bright smile on his face. His dark green, almost black hair contrasted with her vibrant green eyes. "Oka-san, I love you." He would say it all the time, so many times that she would sometimes laugh and hug him tightly. But now he barely spoke to her. He barely even looked at her. And it was her fault. She had left him behind. She had focused all her attention on Reiju. "Why did I let this happen?" Himiko whispered, low enough that her husband couldn't hear, as she felt tears threatening to spill. "Himiko," said Toshinori, not taking his eyes off his two sons. "Don't get distracted. The fight is about to begin." Toshinori made a gesture with his hand, and the fight began. Reiju's body disappeared in a flash of electricity and, a second later, his fist grazed Izuku's cheek, cutting off a few strands of green hair in midair. Izuku turned his head just in time, dodging by mere centimeters the blow that would have crushed his skull. Izuku clicked his tongue. "Nice hit." Reiju landed a few meters away, his wild smile illuminated by the sparks crackling around his body. "Heh, so it won't be as easy as before." Izuku said nothing. His eyes reflected a fierce determination to defeat him. Even though he hadn't spent much time with his brother, he knew that Reiju excelled more in speed than in strength. Reiju extended his palm toward him, and Izuku frowned, uncertain of what he was about to do. Energy began to gather between his fingers. Final flash. Reiju shouted confidently. A blinding bolt of lightning shot from his hand, moving at an almost impossible speed to counter. Izuku barely had time to react before the attack hit him head-on. His body was violently thrown backward, rolling across the ground as steam rose from his scorched skin. The blow was devastating. More than half of his body had been hit by the technique, and now his body refused to respond. Shit. He forced himself to stand up, every muscle burning with pain. "My body, it's not responding," he muttered through gritted teeth, feeling his vision blur. Reiju appeared in front of him in a fraction of a second. Izuku only saw the yellow spark of electricity before a kick struck him directly under the chin. His body was lifted by the impact, but Reiju twisted midair and followed up with a downward kick that slammed Izuku into the ground with brutal force. Guh. Izuku spat out blood and saliva from the impact, feeling his lungs empty from the blow. Reiju landed smoothly, his breathing barely altered. "Is that all, little brother?" he asked with a mocking smile. "I thought you'd be tougher than this." Izuku pressed his hands against the ground, trying to lift himself up, but his arms trembled under his own weight. His vision kept failing, blurring in and out. His breathing was erratic, and the pain burned through every fiber of his body. He tried to move, to force his muscles to respond, but they refused. The previous attack had affected him more than he wanted to admit. "Come on, move." He growled through his teeth, clenching his fists against the dirt. But his body no longer wanted to obey him. "Stop!" Inko shouted, standing up. "Stop this fight." Toshinori raised a hand, stopping her. "It's not over yet. Toshinori, Izuku is hurt." "I know." Toshinori watched closely. "But he hasn't fallen yet." Izuku trembled, blood dripping from the corner of his lips as his muscles screamed with every attempt to rise. The pain was unbearable, but he hadn't been defeated yet. At that moment, a small smile appeared on his face. He had trained with several martial artists, and he knew how to force his body to increase its strength for a brief moment, even if it meant regretting it later. "Is that all you've got, Reiju?" he said hoarsely, daring his brother to keep fighting. Reiju narrowed his eyes, clearly irritated. "What did you say?" His gaze sharpened dangerously as the tension in the air thickened. Izuku spat blood onto the ground and raised his head, his dark green eyes glowing with a dangerous intensity. "If that's the best you can do, then this will be easier than I thought." Reiju gritted his teeth. The electricity around him exploded in a wild flash of light. "Don't get cocky." His eyes sparked with fury, the sound of crackling electricity making the air vibrate with tension. The ground beneath his feet began to crack from the pressure of the energy he was releasing. Izuku, instead of backing down, stood up calmly. His breathing slowed, becoming measured and steady, his pupils narrowing with millimetric precision. His foot struck the ground with such force that the earth beneath him shattered, forming cracks that spread around him. The smile on his face wasn't one of arrogance, it was pure determination. "Come at me, Reiju." Reiju's frown deepened. That look, cold, serene, devoid of any doubt, it irritated him. "Don't act so smug, Izuku." In a flash of yellow light, Reiju launched toward him at blinding speed, his fist crackling with electricity as he aimed a blow at his brother's face. But at the last second, Izuku deflected the punch with an open palm. Reiju barely had time to react before he felt a fist slam into his abdomen. Gah! His body flew backward, crashing into the ground with a loud thud. He coughed up blood. His breathing was ragged, but his eyes still sparked with fury. Toshinori narrowed his eyes, his expression serious. "What was that?" Toshinori murmured. "That shouldn't be possible." Inko felt her heart tighten. Izuku, her little Izuku. He was no longer the boy who used to hug her and tell her how much he loved her. The image of her 4-year-old son, with that adorable smile and those big green eyes, was fading before the cold and ruthless figure now standing in the middle of the battlefield. This isn't right. Reiju launched himself forward again, but a powerful strike sent him flying several meters before he could react. Still, he recovered quickly, landing on one knee. He growled, wiping the blood from his mouth with the back of his hand. His eyes burned with fury and disbelief. How the hell did you do that? You don't have a quirk." Izuku smiled sideways, the kind of smile that belonged to someone who already knew the answer. "Because you're weak." Reiju roared and charged forward. This time, his blows came in a rapid burst of electric flashes. Izuku dodged the first, the second, and the third with minimal movement, deflecting each strike with an open palm or a subtle twist of his body. The air around him trembled with the accumulated energy. Reiju saw an opening and threw a direct punch at Izuku's face, only for his fist to be caught in midair. Izuku's fingers tightened around his wrist and... crack! Reiju screamed in pain as the sound of breaking bone echoed through the air. "Eh!" Izuku let him go and, without giving him a chance to recover, spun on his heel and delivered a powerful sidekick to Reiju's ribs. Reiju's body flew across the battlefield, skidding across the ground and leaving a trail of dust and debris in his wake. Reiju, despite the searing pain tearing through his body, refused to give up. With a determined growl, he raised his only functional hand, his fingers trembling from the strain. Final flash. Reiju roared with fury. From his palm, a surge of pure energy exploded, illuminating the field with a blinding light. But Izuku had no intention of standing still this time. He had already felt the impact of that technique once, and he wasn't about to let it hit him again. He appeared in front of Reiju in the blink of an eye and, without hesitation, delivered a rising kick directly to Reiju's outstretched arm. The impact was devastating. A sickening crack resonated through the air as the bone fractured, twisting his arm into an unnatural angle. Aerg! Reiju's scream of agony echoed across the battlefield. His attack veered off course, shooting toward the sky before erupting into a storm of light. But before Reiju could react, Izuku was already upon him. He raised both arms, preparing to deliver the final blow. It ends here. With inhuman brutality, Izuku brought down a devastating hammer strike. The ground shook from the impact as Reiju's body crashed into it violently. Yet, Reiju was still conscious. Izuku didn't let that stop him. He walked toward his fallen opponent with calm steps, raising his leg to deliver a finishing blow to his head. Enough, Izuku. A sudden kick struck him in the back, sending him crashing to the ground. When he looked up, his eyes met the imposing figure of his father, Toshinori, whose face reflected absolute severity. He's your brother. Were you really going to kill him? This is a fight between brothers, Izuku. Izuku stared at him in disbelief, his breathing still ragged from the fight. What the hell are you talking about? He used a lethal technique. I was just responding the same way. Toshinori didn't reply immediately. His cold gaze was enough to make Izuku feel like his justification meant nothing. He was about to protest again when he saw his mother approaching. For a brief moment, he thought she would defend him. Until... slap. The sound of the slap echoed across the field. Izuku froze, his cheek stinging with a pain that had nothing to do with the blows he had received in the fight. Slowly, he lifted his gaze and saw Himiko standing in front of him, tears streaming down her face. Izuku. Her voice trembled, broken by pain. What have you done? Izuku opened his mouth to respond, but Himiko was no longer looking at him. Without a second thought, she ran toward Reiju, dropping to her knees beside him. Reiju. My baby. She held him desperately, her sobs muffled against her injured son's chest. Reiju, despite his condition, lifted a trembling hand and weakly placed it over hers. I'm sorry. I lost. Shoo, it's okay. Himiko quickly shook her head, gently stroking his face. Her father also approached, placing a hand softly on Reiju's head. It wasn't your fault. Izuku felt his throat tighten. His fingers clenched into fists as the helplessness and fury burned in his chest. It was in that moment that he understood the truth. No matter what he did, it would never be enough for them. He let out a bitter laugh, devoid of any trace of joy. Ah, now I see how it is. Toshinori looked at him with severity. This isn't over, Izuku. What you've done will have consequences. Izuku lowered his head, letting a sarcastic laugh escape his lips. He didn't need to hear anything else. Sure. He turned away, his heavy steps echoing on the shattered ground as he walked off. No one stopped him. No one called out to him. And that hurt more than any blow. The cold air hit his face as he walked through the empty streets, his hands stuffed in the pockets of his torn jacket. The night was dark, but his mind was even cloudier. The strength in his muscles began to fade, leaving a sharp burning sensation in every fiber of his body. He could feel the wounds throbbing beneath his skin, but the physical pain didn't compare to the weight in his chest. Is this it? He muttered to himself, gritting his teeth. Is this all I'm worth to them? He remembered Toshinori's expression, that disappointed, cold look, as if Izuku was no longer worthy of his time. And his mother. The slap still burned on his cheek, but it was her indifference that cut deeper. Himiko didn't run to check if he was okay, she didn't hug him, she only cared about Reiju. His fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles cracked. The pain kept him awake, reminding him he was still alive. But, for what? Izuku. The sweet, playful voice pulled him out of his spiral of thoughts. He turned his head slightly to see Toga sitting on a street lamp, swinging her legs. Her golden eyes glowed in the dark, like those of a cat. Izuku looked at his friend and recounted what had happened. Ah! Those damn idiots! How dare they treat you like that? She jumped down with agility, landing in front of him. She came dangerously close, tilting her head to one side while looking at him with a twisted smile. I should kill them all. Izuku raised an eyebrow, looking at her with amusement. Don't say nonsense. Besides, how do you plan to take down the symbol of peace by yourself? It's not nonsense. Toga pouted, crossing her arms. Who do they think they are, ignoring you like that? You're amazing, Izuku. If they can't see it, then they deserve. Izuku touched her cheek, stopping her words. It's not worth it. Toga frowned, but her cheeks flushed slightly from the contact. You know I'm not a little girl. Izuku smiled sideways. Well then, miss, tell me, did you do what I asked? She puffed her cheeks out, making an adorable grimace. Of course I did. They both headed to Toga's apartment, though along the way, she helped her friend walk. Once she had him settled on the living room sofa, she went to retrieve what Izuku had asked for. After a few minutes, she pulled out a thick folder and handed it to him, her eyes gleaming dangerously. Izuku took it and began flipping through it. Inside, he found detailed information on high-level heroes, some with shady backgrounds. Corruption, bribery, abuse of power. Important names, damning evidence of all their misdeeds. Izuku smiled. You've done a great job. Toga's eyes gleamed with pride. See? I told you I'm useful. Izuku closed the folder, but Toga didn't move. Her breathing became erratic, her pupils dilated from the consuming need. Izuku, she murmured, her voice heavy with hunger and desperation. I can't take it anymore. Izuku looked at her steadily, fully understanding what she meant. He sighed and slightly lowered his shirt, exposing his neck. Make it quick. Toga didn't wait for a second invitation. Her fangs flashed before sinking into his neck. Izuku felt the sharp prick and then the warmth as Toga drank his blood. You know I can buy blood bags from the hospital, right? He commented flatly. Toga pulled back, licking her lips stained with red. Her cheeks were flushed, her pupils wide from pleasure. Those cheap things don't compare to your blood. Izuku shook his head but allowed her to rest against his chest as her breathing steadied. After a while, Izuku had fallen asleep on Toga's lap. His body was covered in bandages, and she had applied a cream for his burns. Toga stroked his hair with one hand while holding a knife with the other. Her breathing became unsteady, her chest rising and falling with uncontrollable tremors. Her golden eyes darkened, clouded by madness, reflecting the primal instinct that consumed her. You'd look better in red, she whispered repeatedly, her voice barely a broken murmur. The knife's blade glimmered under the dim light as she raised it with trembling hands. Her fingers gripped the handle tightly, her knuckles whitening from the pressure. Anxiety devoured her. The need was unbearable. Her gaze slid toward Izuku. She watched him sleep, so calm, so vulnerable. Her pulse quickened, her muscles tensed. The thought of seeing him covered in blood was intoxicating. Toga swallowed hard. No, she shouldn't. He was her only friend. But her hands moved on their own, and with a shaky whisper, she lifted the knife, ready to plunge it into his chest. But at the last second, her eyes flew open, and with an instinct she didn't even understand, her other hand intervened. The knife pierced her wrist. A sharp pain jolted through her, but she didn't drop the knife. Her lips trembled as she watched the blood flow from her own skin. He's my only friend, she repeated in her mind over and over, a desperate plea to keep herself from doing something reckless. Her mind was at war, torn between desire and guilt. He's my only friend. And I almost killed him. A sob escaped her lips. The knife fell to the ground with a faint clink. With her uninjured hand, she covered her mouth, stifling her sobs. She couldn't wake him up. She couldn't let him see her like this. Tears fell from Toga's eyes onto Izuku's face, and her breathing turned into uncontrollable sobs. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Forgive me, she repeated again and again through her tears. She squeezed her eyes shut, holding back, trying to contain the pain. She couldn't lose him. Not Izuku. She didn't know when she had fallen asleep, but when she woke up, she realized her hand was bandaged. Beside her lay a folded note. With trembling fingers, she opened it. To my crazy friend, use the knife for cooking and stop stabbing things. With love, Izuku, the coolest guy on earth. Toga smiled, a weak laugh escaping her lips as she hugged the note against her chest. Baka. She gently caressed the paper as if it were the most valuable object in the world. Her fingers trembled slightly, her breath still unsteady. She carefully folded it and placed it inside the inner pocket of her jacket, feeling the warmth of those words spread through her chest, calming the storm in her mind. Izuku always knew what to say to make her feel better, even when her instincts pushed her to the edge of madness. He was her anchor, the only person who understood the chaos in her mind without judging her. She looked at him sleeping on the couch, his breathing calm and steady, the dark green strands of his hair gently falling over his forehead. His face seemed so peaceful that, for a moment, Toga felt completely at ease. With a playful smile, she ran her fingers through his hair. Sleepyhead. She leaned in and placed a soft kiss on his forehead before resting her cheek against his head. A few knocks on the door made her look up. Izuku let out a small grunt, turning onto his side. Toga rolled her eyes. Who could it be at this hour? The door opened, and Itsuka peeked her head in with a mischievous smile. I've already loaned my boyfriend to you for long enough. I suppose you've had your romantic dream. Toga frowned, pouting. It wasn't romantic. I was just keeping an eye on him. Itsuka laughed, fully aware of what was going on. Toga liked Izuku, but Itsuka didn't mind her being close to him because she wasn't a jealous person, and besides, Toga was her friend. She knew Toga would never cross a line with her boyfriend. Sure. Well, get up, Izuku, we've got work to do. Izuku slowly opened his eyes and sat up, rubbing his face with one hand. Is it time already? Itsuka walked over and took his hand, intertwining their fingers. It's almost time to head to UA, but before that. Izuku smiled and leaned in to kiss her softly on the lips. We need to keep getting stronger. Itsuka smiled back, her eyes shining with determination as she held her fist out to him. Count on it. Izuku bumped his fist against hers and watched her leave the apartment. She had an errand to run before training. Toga observed the scene with a crooked smile. You two look adorable together, you know. Izuku glanced at her from the corner of his eye. Jealous? Toga shrugged. Maybe. She said goodbye to her friend before heading home. When she arrived, she noticed a tense atmosphere. Her mother and Toshinori were waiting at the door, both with crossed arms and serious expressions. Now what? Izuku asked coldly, stopping a few steps away from them. Toshinori stepped forward, his shadow looming over Izuku. After seriously injuring your brother, do you think there won't be consequences? Izuku stared back at him, his face completely devoid of remorse. Before anything else, give it to me. Give you what? Toshinori frowned. Izuku calmly extended his hand. Give me the one for all. Toshinori's expression hardened. Are you serious? Is that what you're thinking about? You don't even ask if your brother is okay. Izuku didn't flinch at his father's shout. He's strong, so he should be fine. I remind you that you trained him, unlike me, who had to manage on my own. Toshinori gritted his teeth, his chest a mix of anger and guilt. Izuku was right, but that didn't make his anger disappear. Before he could respond, Inko stepped forward, her eyes glistening with tears. She stood in front of Izuku, just inches from his face. Look me in the eyes and tell me, do you really feel no guilt for what you did? Izuku looked at her directly, unblinking. My answer is no, mother. Inko let out a shaky sigh, her hands clutching tightly to her chest. Where did I go wrong? She murmured, lowering her gaze. Izuku watched her fragile posture, but he made no effort to comfort her. Leave. Izuku frowned. What? Inko looked up, tears streaming down her cheeks. Go. You're no longer my son. From today on, you'll stop being my son. The silence was overwhelming. Toshinori looked at Inko with surprise, but he didn't intervene. Izuku felt a sharp pain in his chest, but he quickly suppressed it. Can you repeat that? He asked coldly. Inko took a step back, wiping her tears. Leave, Izuku. You're no longer my son. Izuku didn't respond immediately. The truth was, he had been managing on his own for a long time. Still, he couldn't help but feel a slight pressure in his chest upon hearing those words from his mother's mouth. Fine. He entered the house, went upstairs, and began gathering the few valuable things from his room, an old photo of him and Reiju as children, a couple of notebooks with notes about heroes, and a jacket Toshinori had given him years ago. And most importantly, a large sum of money. When he went back downstairs, Toshinori was still standing beside Inko, who kept her gaze fixed on the floor. Izuku stopped in front of his father and extended his hand. "I won the fight, so give me the one for all." Toshinori stared at him. "Is that what you think?" Izuku smiled slightly. "You were the one who said that whoever trained the hardest would be the worthy successor. So." Toshinori gritted his teeth. "You have no idea what you're asking for." Izuku leaned in slightly, his smile growing with a cold, calculated confidence. "Of course I do. It's the quirk you promised me, and now I want it." The tension in the air was suffocating. As for Izuku, he was excited because, after so many years of effort, he would finally obtain a quirk. Then Toshinori dropped the truth. "Your brother already has the one for all." Izuku froze and stared at him in disbelief. His whole world seemed to stop at that moment. The echo of those words struck his mind like a hammer. He had trained like a maniac his entire life for a single purpose, to have a quirk. A quirk to change his destiny, so no one would ever underestimate him for being quirkless. So no one would ever mock him again. With that power, he would become the strongest hero in the world. But now he understood. His father had lied to him all those years. He never thought of him as a worthy successor. Izuku slowly lowered his head, his eyes covered by his hair. "Tell me the truth, Yagi-san. Did you ever actually intend to give it to me if I won, or was it just a farce all these years?" Inko averted her gaze, a hint of guilt in her eyes, but it was Toshinori who faced him directly. "Between the two of you, he was the more worthy." A chill ran down Izuku's spine. His breathing became heavy, his heart pounding against his chest. "Worthy?" His voice came out low and dangerous. He lifted his head, his dark green eyes burning with restrained fury. "Are you referring to that weakling who almost died at my hands?" Toshinori frowned. "Izuku. Watch your words. I am your father." Izuku let out a hollow, humorless laugh. "You have no right to judge me, Yagi-san. You were the one who set that ridiculous condition. The one who trains the hardest will be worthy. Did it bother you that the outcome wasn't what you expected?" Then he shouted angrily, "Did it bother you that your favorite son lost?" Inko clasped her hands tightly against her chest, looking at Izuku with sadness. "Izuku. Please. It's not what you think." Izuku glanced at her from the corner of his eye, his smile fading. "You knew too. Didn't you?" Inko's silence was enough of an answer. That silence was all Izuku needed to make his decision. Now he would leave without feeling the slightest trace of doubt or guilt. The last thing he saw was his mother's pained eyes because she was the one who had suggested he leave. He saw the regret in her. But it no longer mattered. He would never look back. After that, he trained relentlessly in the following weeks with brutal focus. His body grew stronger, his mind sharper, his movements more precise. Now he was ready to go to UA. By his side was his girlfriend, Itsuka, who looked at him with a gentle yet determined smile. "Let's do our best, Izuku-kun." Itsuka winked at him before heading to another section of the entrance exam. "Count on it." For the written exam, Izuku achieved perfection. Not a single mistake, not a single uncertain answer. Everything precise. And the practical exam. It was a spectacle of destruction. He destroyed more robots than anyone else, moving with an almost inhuman agility. When he saw some robots causing trouble for other students, he destroyed them as well. But instead of receiving gratitude, he only got complaints. "Idiot, that one was mine. You stole my points, you jerk," a girl shouted, her face red with frustration. Izuku ignored her and kept going. He destroyed more robots, eliminated threats efficiently, but the responses from the other students were always the same. "I could handle it myself, you idiot. You were in my way." Izuku didn't pay attention to them. It didn't matter what they thought. He wasn't there to make friends. A few days later, the devastating news arrived. A holographic projection appeared in his room, showing Nizu's polite smile. "I'm sorry, young Midoriya, but due to suggestions from reliable sources regarding your inappropriate behavior and aggressive attitude toward other competitors, you will not be admitted to UA." Izuku replayed the recording over and over, as if doing so would change the words. But they never did. His eyes filled with tears as his fists trembled. He quickly understood. Those reliable sources were his parents. "Please, Izuku, calm down." That was when he heard Toga's desperate cries. She was beside him, her eyes glossy and her hands shaking. "Izuku." Toga threw herself at him, hugging him tightly. "Izuku, look at me." Izuku barely reacted. His arms hung limply at his sides while Toga buried her face in his chest, sobbing. "They don't understand anything. They're wrong." Toga lifted her head, her yellow eyes glistening with tears that slipped uncontrollably down her cheeks. "But I understand you. I believe in you." Izuku closed his eyes. His breathing was heavy, his heart hammering against his chest. Toga's words echoed in his mind, piercing through the layers of frustration and anger that enveloped him. Why did Toga, of all people, still believe in him when everyone else had abandoned him? "It doesn't matter," he whispered, his voice so soft that Toga barely heard it. "If UA doesn't want me, I'll find another way." Toga hugged him tighter, her body trembling violently against his. "I'll go with you." Her voice was fragile, broken by the weight of her emotions. "Wherever you go." Her hands clung desperately to Izuku's shirt as tears flowed uncontrollably down her face. "Because I love you." Izuku's eyes opened, surprised. The air seemed to leave his lungs in a silent whisper. Did Toga love him? Of course, he appreciated her. She had always been by his side, silently supporting him, even when he was drowning in darkness. But he was with Itsuka. His relationship with Kendo wasn't perfect, but he loved her, and he couldn't betray her. That was why he had to reject Toga. Toga saw the pain in his eyes, and her smile crumbled. Fresh tears began to well up as she tried to wipe them away with the back of her hand, but they kept falling. "I know," she murmured with a broken voice. "I know you don't love me. No one could love a monster like me." Izuku felt his chest tighten at her words. "Don't say that. But it's the truth." A bitter, almost shattered laugh escaped Toga. "I'm used to it. I shouldn't be surprised, but it still hurts." Izuku hugged her. Toga didn't resist. Her body collapsed against his, her arms wrapping around his back as her face pressed into his chest. The warmth of her tears soaked through his shirt. "Can I ask you something?" Toga's voice was barely a whisper, an echo broken by her sobs. "Can you give me a kiss?" Izuku looked at her, his green eyes meeting her golden ones, clouded by tears. He knew it was wrong. He knew that after this, he would have to apologize to Itsuka, that he would have to face the consequences. But seeing Toga's tears, feeling her trembling against him, he couldn't say no. He nodded slowly. Toga leaned in and brushed her lips against his. Very slowly, their lips met in a gentle kiss. The sensation was delicate yet charged with desperation and longing. Toga closed her eyes, savoring each second as if it would be the last. A part of her knew this moment would never happen again. Izuku felt Toga's hands grip his shirt tightly, and even though he knew it was wrong, he kissed her back. His lips moved with a cautious tenderness, and he felt the warmth and pain residing within Toga. Then, the worst possible scenario unfolded. A dull sound shook them, a bag falling to the floor. Izuku and Toga quickly pulled apart and turned toward the door. Itsuka Kendo stood there, her eyes wide, her hands trembling. Tears streamed down her face as her breathing became uneven. Her expression was a mix of disbelief and heartbreak. "Why?" Itsuka's voice was barely a broken whisper. Izuku quickly stood up, his hands reaching out to her. "Itsuka, Why?" Itsuka's cry tore through the room. Her fists clenched tightly as her shoulders trembled from the effort to hold back her tears. "How could you?" Izuku took a step toward her, but Itsuka immediately backed away, her expression growing more furious. "Don't come any closer." Toga stood up, her eyes still red from crying. "Itsuka. Shut up." Itsuka's voice cut through the air like a whip. You knew we were together, and yet. You still did this. You were supposed to be my friend." Tears continued to fall down Itsuka's face as she covered her mouth with her hands, trying to stifle her sobs. "Izuku. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I thought you loved me. I thought you truly loved me." Izuku felt a sharp pain in his chest as he saw Itsuka crying. He took a step toward her, but she moved further away, retreating even more. "If you ever loved me at all." Itsuka's eyes glimmered with a mix of rage and deep sorrow. "Then don't ever try to find me again." Izuku felt as if the ground had crumbled beneath his feet. "Itsuka." But she was already turning away. She ran out of the room, her sobs echoing in the air. Izuku took a step toward the door, but a hand stopped him. "Let her go." Toga's voice was low and shaky. "You can't fix it now. Let her calm down and then find a way to explain what happened." Izuku stood still. Toga's hands were still trembling as she looked at him with a mix of guilt and sadness. "I'm sorry." Toga's voice was barely a whisper. "I just wanted a moment with you." Izuku closed his eyes. The weight of what he had done crushed him from the inside. I need to be alone." Toga slowly released him, her hands shaking as they slipped down his arms. Her expression twisted in a mix of pain and resignation. She knew Izuku needed space, but that didn't make the hollow feeling in her chest any less painful. "It's okay," she murmured, forcing a weak smile as tears continued to stream down her face. "But if you change your mind, I'll be here." Izuku didn't respond. His face was hidden beneath his hair as he turned toward the door. His footsteps echoed on the wooden floor, each one heavier than the last. Toga watched him disappear through the doorway, feeling something inside her shatter into 1,000 pieces. "Izuku," she whispered, hugging herself as more tears fell from her eyes. But the pain for Izuku didn't end there. He spent the following weeks trying to find a new path, a second chance to fulfill his dream of becoming a hero. He applied to every academy, every hero agency that accepted students in training. But one by one, every application was rejected. The responses were cold and mechanical. "We regret to inform you that we currently have no space for you." Each rejection letter was like a new wound to his already broken heart. And then there was Itsuka. Every time he tried to see her, it was her father who met him. The first time, it was just a door slammed in his face. The second time, a punch to the stomach that left him doubled over on the ground. "Stay away from my daughter," the man had yelled as Izuku struggled to catch his breath. The third time, the blow landed squarely on his jaw. The pain worsened with each visit, each one harsher than the last. But Izuku didn't fight back. He stood there, firm, enduring it all in silence. Maybe, if he held on long enough, Itsuka would come out, and they could fix things. But that never happened. Today, once again, the beating repeated. A final blow made him stagger, his legs giving out until he fell to his knees on the cold ground. His breathing was heavy, his hands trembled against the hard surface. But he didn't get up. That was when he heard the door open, and a familiar voice broke the silence. It was Itsuka's mother, who had just stepped outside. She looked like an older version of Itsuka, same orange hair, the same gentle features, but now hardened by pain. She crouched beside him, holding a glass of water in one hand and a small pill in the other. "Here, son. This will ease the pain." Izuku took the glass with trembling hands and swallowed the pill without a word. She remained silent for a moment, watching him with a sad expression. "Tell me, why did you hurt her?" she asked, her voice breaking, heavy with sorrow. "I really thought you and Itsuka would be happy, that you'd be part of our family." Izuku gripped the glass tightly, his knuckles turning white. "It's true she saw me kissing someone," he murmured, "but that's not the whole story." He told her everything. About Toga, about the kiss, about his friend's vulnerability, about the weight of the pain she carried, and about how, when Itsuka saw them, she never gave him the chance to explain. He told her about the emptiness he felt afterward and the anguish of losing her without being able to tell her the truth. Itsuka's mother listened in complete silence. Her eyes reflected infinite sadness, as if she could feel his suffering in her own heart. When Izuku finished speaking, she gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Listen, Izuku," she said softly. "I don't think she wants to see you again. Not after this. Please. Don't hurt her anymore. And don't keep hurting yourself." Izuku felt something inside him crack. Tears began to slide down his face. Itsuka's mother leaned in and hugged him briefly. It was a warmth almost unbearable. Take care of yourself. Maybe this is for the best." With those words, she stood up and slowly walked away, returning to her home. From the second floor, a figure hid behind the window, watching in silence. It was Izuku. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but she didn't need to. Her eyes caught everything, the pain reflected on Izuku's face, the way her mother hugged him after his confession, and how, in the end, he was left alone on the ground, head down, tears falling silently. Izuku felt a lump in her throat. Her own eyes filled with tears as she pressed her lips tightly together. She still loved him. But the pain was stronger. So she closed her heart. "I hate you," she whispered, her voice breaking. But even as she said it, the tears fell harder. Because she knew it wasn't true. She still loved him, but she couldn't forgive him. Not after what she had seen. She walked away from the window, her steps echoing on the wooden floor as she headed to her room. Maybe it was best to focus on her classes at UA and forget about him. And so, in a short time, Izuku's life fell apart. He was now living in Toga's small apartment. He had spent an entire week in bed, motionless, silent, eating only enough to stay alive. He stared at the ceiling, his thoughts spinning in circles, trapped in an endless cycle of pain and regret. What do I do? What am I supposed to do? That question echoed in his mind over and over, but he couldn't find an answer. His eyes were red, not just from crying but from exhaustion. He had barely slept. He had barely breathed. Toga sat beside him on the bed, looking at him with concern. She wanted to say something, anything that might get a reaction from him, but words seemed useless against his complete silence. "Izuku," she whispered, leaning toward him desperately. "Please. Say something. Stop ignoring me." She pleaded, her voice breaking after days of waiting without a response from him. Toga pressed her lips together, her chest tight with anguish. She knew him, she knew his mind was trapped in a maze of pain, but seeing him so close yet so distant, unable to reach him, was tearing her apart. Finally, Izuku closed his eyes. And then, at last, he spoke. "I can't," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what to do anymore." Toga looked at him, her eyes filling with tears. She moved closer and gently took his hand. She leaned slightly and rested her cheek against his chest, listening to the sound of his heartbeat. With her other hand, she softly ran her fingers through his hair, slow and gentle, trying to comfort him, even though she herself longed for someone to comfort her, to ease the pain that still lingered in her heart. But that didn't matter. What mattered was helping the person she loved. Izuku's gaze drifted to the wall. There was an old, faded calendar hanging there. The red square marking the day caught his attention. February 14th. A bitter smile formed on his lips. "Happy Valentine's Day, Toga." Toga looked up, a little confused at first, but as she followed his gaze to the calendar, she understood. A small smile appeared on her face as she wiped the tears from her face with her hand. "You actually remembered today is Valentine's Day?" Izuku let out a melancholic smile. "Of course I remember. I was supposed to surprise Izuku today." Toga put a hand on her hip and gave him a playful smile. "Well, Itsuka's not here. But you are. So, how about celebrating it with me?" She leaned toward him, a playful glimmer in her eyes. "No need to say anything else. Today, we'll celebrate to the fullest." Izuku looked at her in surprise, wondering how someone who had suffered so much in her life could still be so radiant. "Are you serious?" Toga snapped her fingers and winked. "Am I ever not serious? That's exactly the part that worries me." Izuku let out a tired laugh as she grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the door. They spent the rest of the day in a way that definitely didn't match the traditional idea of a Valentine's Day date. Instead of buying chocolates, they went to a store and bought a dozen cans of cheap beer. Then, instead of a relaxing walk in the park or a romantic dinner, Toga had the brilliant idea of recreating those videos of people riding bikes down steep hills. Izuku looked at her like she had completely lost her mind. "Are you sure?" Toga climbed onto the bike, positioning herself right behind him with a mischievous smile. "The question is, for you or for me? For both of us." Izuku sighed, seeing how excited she seemed, but he was glad to see her feeling better. And honestly, doing these crazy things was also helping him deal with his own pain. Now, they had reached a very high and very steep spot, and Toga was beyond excited. "If we make it down safely, you owe me a date." Before he could respond, they were already speeding down the hill, the wind hitting their faces as the wheels bounced over rocks and potholes. Izuku gripped the bike's handlebars tightly while Toga laughed uncontrollably behind him. "Izuku, turn now," she shouted. Izuku jerked the bike just in time, narrowly avoiding a massive rock that almost sent them flying. But just when he thought they were safe, he saw a cat darting across their path. "Oh, shit!" Izuku yanked the handlebars, and suddenly, they were airborne. Toga screamed with excitement as the cat passed safely beneath them. They landed with a heavy thud, but somehow managed to keep their balance. "Izuku, this is amazing!" Toga shouted, hugging him tightly from behind. When they finally reached the bottom of the hill, Izuku was panting, adrenaline rushing through his body and his heart pounding loudly in his ears. "Are you trying to kill us?" Toga let out a cheerful laugh. "Of course not. But wasn't it fun?" Izuku shook his head, but he couldn't help smiling. The night took an even more unexpected turn. Instead of watching a movie or relaxing, they ended up in the middle of a street fight. A few gang members thought it would be fun to rob them. Bad idea. Izuku was on top of one of them, his fist bloodied after knocking the guy out. His cheek had a burning cut, but he was more worried about Toga. When he turned toward her, he saw her at her most dangerous state. That psychotic smile was on her face as she brandished a knife against 3 guys lying on the ground, bleeding and begging for their lives. "Toga." Izuku approached her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Don't forget what really matters." The 3 gang members looked at Izuku like he was an angel who had come down to save them. Toga's expression suddenly shifted. "Their wallets and cash," Toga said, pointing at the guys. Izuku let out a crooked smile. "Exactly." A few minutes later, when the police arrived, they found the 4 gang members tied up with a rope, dressed only in their underwear, all pressed together tightly. One of the officers let out a mocking laugh. "Guys, I get it, it's Valentine's Day, but that's what motels are for." The other officer took a picture with his phone, clearly entertained by the scene. However, noticing his colleague's looks and the hardened expression of his superior, he cleared his throat and adopted a more professional stance. "Don't get me wrong, this is evidence." From a nearby rooftop, Izuku and Toga watched them, their faces barely visible in the darkness of the night. Izuku covered his mouth to stifle his laughter, but Toga wasn't as lucky and burst out laughing, her voice echoing in the alley. "Did you see that?" Toga nudged Izuku, her eyes gleaming with amusement. "Yeah." Izuku smiled. "That picture is definitely going to make the rounds on social media. How embarrassing." Toga laughed, resting her head on Izuku's shoulder. When things finally settled down, they quietly left into the night. By early morning, with the cold air hitting their faces and the city lights flickering in the distance, they returned to Toga's apartment. Izuku collapsed onto the couch, his legs heavy with exhaustion and the alcohol still running through his system. Toga sat beside him, her face flushed and a mischievous smile on her lips. "Izuku." Her fingers gently stroked his cheek. "I want you right now." Izuku let out a hiccup and managed a half smile. "Really?" Toga leaned in, her lips almost brushing against his. She looked at him for a moment, breathing heavily. With a gentle movement, Izuku lifted her and carried her to the bed. Toga gazed at him, her golden eyes shining softly in the room's dim light. "What about Itsuka?" Toga whispered suddenly, and Izuku paused for a second. He lowered his gaze, a flicker of sadness crossing his face. "She didn't want to listen to me. So, I'll leave her alone." Toga stared at him, feeling her heart pound intensely. Without thinking, she grabbed him by the shirt and pulled him toward her. Their lips met in a kiss full of emotion, a mix of desperation and longing. Izuku kissed her back, wrapping his arms around her. Toga felt an overwhelming wave of happiness, as if all the pain and weight she had endured throughout her life had been worth it for this moment. Hours later, as the sun began to rise and the city's lights slowly faded, Izuku woke up, feeling the sharp sting of a hangover. "Damn. I'm never drinking again," he muttered quietly, covering his eyes with his arm to block out the light. "People who say that always end up drinking again." From the kitchen, Toga appeared, holding a tray. She wore an oversized shirt that clearly belonged to Izuku, her hair messy. She placed the tray on the table and sat beside him, gently running her fingers through his hair. "Come on, eat something. I don't want you dying in my bed." Izuku looked at her with a tired smile. "Are you my nurse now?" Toga smirked. "I could get used to it." Izuku closed his eyes and exhaled slowly, letting the warmth of the room and Toga's presence surround him. The smell of freshly made breakfast filled the air, a mix of coffee and toast that made his stomach growl with hunger. Toga sat beside him, her legs tucked beneath her, watching him with a playful smile. "You should eat something." Toga slid a piece of toast toward him. "If you keep this up, I'll end up being your nurse forever." Izuku took the toast and took a bite, looking at her with sleepy eyes. "That wouldn't be so bad. Me taking care of you, or me being your personal nurse?" Izuku let out a soft chuckle. "Both." Toga leaned in, resting her head on his shoulder while wrapping an arm around his waist. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but comforting. After everything they had been through, finding those small moments of calm together felt almost miraculous. And so, the course of history changed. A boy destined to become the symbol of peace had twisted his fate. The events and experiences Izuku went through pulled him away from his predetermined path, facing choices that transformed his life in ways he could have never imagined. Years passed, and now Izuku and Toga worked as mercenaries, hunting both heroes and villains. They only took jobs when their targets had committed crimes, betrayal, abuse of power, corruption. They didn't forgive. There were no second chances. In the world of heroes and villains, they became a dark legend, feared by all. The line between good and evil blurred more and more. Then came the war between heroes and villains. It was during that time that All for One contacted them. The offer was simple, a few quirks in exchange for their services. Confident in his power, AFO thought he could control them like he had so many others. But Izuku and Toga were not mere pawns on a chessboard. On a dark night, in the heart of All for One's lair, Toga approached him with a syringe in her hand. The substance inside glowed with a greenish light, designed by her secret partner, Melissa Shield. AFO, with an arrogant smile, reached out toward Toga. "Well done. Now the world will be ours." Izuku had promised him a weapon designed to take one for all from the heir of his greatest rival, All Might. And that weapon was now supposed to be in his hands. But what he didn't expect was that it was all a trick. In a moment of distraction, Izuku positioned himself behind him and injected something into his body. At first, AFO thought he would simply counterattack the traitors, but soon he collapsed to the ground. What Izuku had injected into him had been created by Melissa with a single purpose: to end AFO. "Why?" AFO asked, feeling his strength slip away. Izuku looked at him with a cold expression. "Because sometimes actions have consequences. And you, my friend, should have died for them long ago." A burst of green light exploded from Izuku's fingers, shattering the upper part of AFO's skull in a single blow. The villain's body was left lifeless. But Izuku wasn't finished. He took the syringe Toga held and, without hesitation, plunged it directly into AFO's chest. He watched as the luminescent substance spread through his veins, glowing intensely before it began to retreat, returning to the syringe. This time, the greenish liquid crackled with sparks of white energy, a tremendous power visibly coursing through it. Izuku didn't hesitate. He pulled the needle from AFO's body and, without a second thought, drove it into his own arm. Arg! Izuku screamed as the raw, uncontrollable power took over his body. His veins glowed with a mix of green and white as the energy tore through him from within. His muscles strained under the overload of power. That was when the lair's doors exploded open. Mirko appeared first, blood on her knuckles and a murderous glare. At her side was Reiju, Izuku's twin brother, his eyes blazing with golden and green lightning, the power of his quirk enhanced by One for All. Behind them were several heroes, ready to strike. "You're under arrest." Mirko's voice resonated with authority as she advanced without hesitation, her steps echoing against the concrete that cracked beneath her strength. Her gaze was pure determination, but a shadow of her past loomed over her. One of her ears, or what remained of it, was a reminder of a mistake she would never forgive herself for. She cursed herself for not stopping her former protégé earlier, for hesitating. In that battle, that moment of doubt had cost her a part of herself, but this time she wouldn't make the same mistake. There was no room for hesitation. Her gaze hardened, the muscles in her legs tensed, ready to launch into the fight. Today she would take down Izuku and his girlfriend. Toga tilted her head, a dangerous smile curving her lips. Her amber eyes glimmered with a dangerous glow as she activated one of the quirks AFO had given her. Her gaze shone with a crimson light. Attack each other until there's no one left. Her voice, usually playful, was now laced with venom. Izuku still couldn't fight, so she had to buy time. The command was absolute, sinking into the minds of the weaker heroes. Immediately, some of them staggered, their expressions went blank, and their pupils dilated into empty voids. A second later, their hands, once used to protect, rose against their own allies. And no. A hero struggled to resist, his jaw trembling. Aeruk. But his fingers had already wrapped around a comrade's throat. Chaos erupted. Punches, explosions, screams of confusion and horror. The involuntary betrayal tore through the front line as the heroes were forced to fight each other. Mirko gritted her teeth and cursed under her breath. Her instincts screamed at her to attack, but she had to think fast. If she fell under the mind control, it would be over for her and the others. Fight, damn it, she roared, clenching her fists until her knuckles cracked. Toga let out a pleased giggle. Oh, Mirko-chan, you're still as intense as ever. Still mad about the cut my boyfriend gave you? She looked at her with a sweet expression, like a child playing an innocent game. So, what are you going to do now? Will you let them tear each other apart, or are you going to stop my boyfriend and me? The rabbit hero sharpened her gaze. She wasn't going to fall for Toga's game. This time, she was the one leading the hunt, and she was going to stop them both. Or at least, that's what she thought. But she had to turn her body at the last second to avoid a burst of fire that managed to scorch part of her shoulder. Damn it, stop! Mirko shouted, dodging a strike from one of the controlled heroes. Toga took advantage of the distraction to slip away with Izuku, who was still struggling to catch his breath. Quickly, she led him out of the room while the explosions and chaos continued behind them. They managed to reach a dark alley, the streetlights flickering over rain-soaked streets. But they weren't alone. From above, Reiju descended with a deafening crash. His body glowed with yellow and green sparks, his hair floating from the energy surging through him. This ends here, brother. The ground beneath his feet cracked under his power. Surrender, Izuku. Izuku stared at him, still breathing heavily. Toga stepped in front of him, her eyes blazing with fury. I won't let you touch him. Reiju narrowed his eyes, his pupils crackling with yellow electricity as a bolt of lightning flashed in the sky behind him. Raindrops slid down his face. And what are you going to do, Toga? His voice was cold and dismissive. Toga smirked maliciously, flashing her fangs. Her tongue slowly ran across her lower lip as adrenaline surged through her, making her tremble. Do you really want to find out? Reiju let out a dry laugh and stepped forward, making the ground crack beneath his feet. The air grew thicker, a suffocating pressure that made the nearby streetlights flicker and the puddles ripple. The electricity coursing through his body crackled more intensely, ready to unleash destruction. Toga licked her lips, ready for the fight, determined to buy her boyfriend enough time to recover. Her eyes gleamed with excitement as her fingers gripped one of her knives. The blade reflected the flickering streetlights, and her blood boiled with the desire to leap into battle. Izuku watched it all, still breathing heavily, but his determination remained steady. He wouldn't let that bastard of a brother hurt Toga. He clenched his fists, feeling the power of all for one coursing through every cell of his body. The power was immense and chaotic, like a storm ready to explode inside him. Yet he could feel it, with every passing second, that power was becoming his. Reiju. His voice was low and threatening. Don't you dare lay a finger on her. If you want to fight, then come on. Reiju grinned, a twisted smile that radiated both confidence and malice. The electricity coursing through his body crackled harder, lighting up the street with golden flashes. With pleasure. Without warning, Reiju vanished from sight. A golden lightning bolt streaked through the air, and in the blink of an eye, his fist was inches from Toga's face. The gust of wind from his approach made her hair whip violently, but before the strike could land, a firm hand stopped it. The impact sounded like a thunderclap. Izuku had appeared at the last moment, gripping Reiju's arm with inhuman strength. Toga's face lit up with joy, seeing that her boyfriend had not only blocked the attack but was now stronger than ever. What a pain. Reiju clicked his tongue, looking at Izuku with a mix of surprise and irritation. You're still a nuisance, just like always. And I always will be, Izuku growled, tightening his grip on his brother's arm. His hold was so brutal that the electricity surrounding Reiju crackled erratically, unable to break free immediately. The shockwave from their clash spread outward, forming a devastating ring. The windows of nearby buildings shattered into 1,000 pieces, parked cars flipped over like toys, and the pavement cracked, forming craters beneath their feet. Without warning, Izuku grabbed Reiju by the neck with terrifying speed and threw him far from the area, distancing him from Toga to keep her from getting caught in the crossfire. Reiju's body flew through the air like a projectile and crashed into an empty building, sending a shower of debris into the air. But before the dust could settle, a green flash emerged from the rubble. Reiju was already on his feet. With a simple motion of his arm, he brushed off the debris, a confident expression on his face. He still didn't see Izuku as a threat. So, you're not going to give up, his brother said, cracking his neck, ready to beat him down. Reiju narrowed his eyes. Mother and father are disappointed in you. They didn't raise you to become this. Izuku laughed at that, a laugh without a trace of sadness or joy. Do you think I care? They made it clear they only wanted one of their sons. Reiju's eyes flashed with fury. The electricity coursing through his body intensified, amplifying the power of one for all until more green lightning crackled around him. Izuku, who had absorbed part of the power of all for one, began to manifest his own lightning, but it was completely different from his brother's. Instead of the signature green, his energy flickered in a pure, blinding white. There were no more words. They charged at each other, colliding in a brutal clash, their blows creating sonic explosions that split the street in two. Izuku spun through the air, delivering a kick powered by his energy, but Reiju blocked it with his forearm and countered with a hook that slammed into his brother's torso, sending him crashing into another building. Before Izuku could recover, Reiju appeared in front of him, slamming him into the ground with a burst of electricity that shook the entire area. Izuku grunted and, with a shout, channeled his energy to launch himself back into the air. His fist glowed with a terrifying intensity as he shot upward at high speed. Reiju smirked, satisfied, and launched his own punch. Their blows collided in a titanic explosion. The shockwave tore through everything in its path, sending debris flying, ripping trees from their roots, and leaving a massive crack in the earth. Both were forced back, repelled by each other's strength. Reiju wiped his lip and noticed he was bleeding. You've got more strength than I thought. Izuku wiped the dust from his face and smirked defiantly. And I haven't even used all my power yet. Lightning still crackled around them. The fight had only just begun. What followed was monumental. Each blow was a surge of power that shook the city, each movement a manifestation of the brutality and control they had perfected over the years. When dawn finally came, only one body remained standing. Izuku, one eye closed and blood dripping from his lips, stood tall while his brother lay beneath his feet, barely alive. Reiju's body was covered in blood and cuts, his breathing weak and ragged. Izuku crouched down, pressing harder against Reiju's chest, staring directly into his eyes. Any last words, brother? His voice was calm, almost tired. Reiju remained silent, his chest rising and falling with difficulty. The confidence that had always defined him had vanished. He looked at his brother, and for the first time in a long while, he truly saw him. He knew Izuku wasn't a villain. Or at least, not entirely. He knew that the murders he'd committed targeted only Japan's worst criminals. Izuku had done what heroes couldn't, cleansed the shadows from within. Visit Mom. Reiju whispered, his voice barely audible. She's not well since you left. Toga appeared beside Izuku, holding two syringes in her hands. One of them glowed with a green liquid, the same used on All for One, while the other was empty. It's too late for reconciliation, Izuku said, taking the empty syringe and injecting it into his brother's arm. The syringe began to fill with blood, and his brother let out a pained whimper, but Izuku didn't care. Seconds later, he injected the other syringe into his chest. The green liquid spread through Reiju's veins, making his skin glow as small golden and green lightning bolts crackled across his body. Then, the liquid retreated, flowing back into the syringe. "What are you doing?" Reiju whispered, feeling his time slipping away. Izuku stared at him, his eyes disturbingly calm. "It's time for AFO and OFA to work together." He raised 2 fingers to his brother's forehead, and a surge of green and white energy shot through the air, obliterating Reiju's body in an explosion of light. Izuku felt a strange mix of victory and emptiness. His breathing was heavy, sweat rolling down his forehead. Toga watched him, saw the dimmed light in his eyes, and simply pulled him into an embrace. "Remember, you're not alone in this," she whispered, burying her face in his neck. Izuku closed his eyes and rested his head on her shoulder. High above them, news helicopters circled the sky, capturing every second of the devastating battle. Their bright camera lights illuminated the battlefield, broadcasting to the world the titanic clash of the Midoriya brothers. Many had just witnessed the fall of the one who could have been the next symbol of peace. From the Midoriya household, Himiko watched everything on television, her face drenched in tears. Her hands trembled violently as she clutched the fabric of her blouse, horror constricting her chest with unbearable pain. On the screen, images of her sons filled the broadcast, one surrounded by white lightning, while the other had been erased from existence. It had all happened before her eyes, and all she had done was watch in terror as her 2 babies fought to the death. Toshinori tried to hold her, to offer something resembling comfort, but his own expression was shattered under the weight of what had just occurred. He was just as broken as his wife. Inko turned to him, her eyes swollen from crying, fury and despair burning in her gaze. In that moment of unbearable vulnerability, she needed someone to blame, and the only person she saw was him. "This is all your damn fault," she screamed, her voice raw and broken. Her fists clenched, and she struck his chest with all the strength she had left. "If it weren't for your quirk, I would still have both my babies." Each hit carried her anguish, her regret, the unbearable pain of all she had lost. Toshinori didn't resist. He didn't lift his hands to stop her. He just stood there, head bowed, taking every blow without a word. Because he knew it was true. He had failed them all. Inko's eyes burned with relentless agony. She hit him one last time before her body finally gave in. Her legs trembled, sobs racked her frame, and then she collapsed to her knees, her entire body shaking from the suffering consuming her. "My babies! My babies!" Her voice shattered into 1,000 pieces, like glass breaking against the floor. "Forgive me, Izuku." Tears streamed down her face, soaking the fabric of her dress as her cries filled the room with the unbearable weight of a mother's agony. Toshinori knelt beside her, but he didn't reach for her. He had no right to. Not after everything he had done, not after setting her sons against each other. Inko squeezed her eyes shut, her thoughts spiraling into a storm of guilt and despair. She cursed the day she had met her husband, the day her family had become the battleground for a war that should have never existed. But deep down, she knew the truth. At some point, she had played a role in this outcome as well. She had let Izuku grow up in his brother's shadow, had failed to protect him when he needed her most, had stayed silent when she should have spoken up, had withheld love when he had desperately needed it. And now, all that neglect, all those mistakes, had fueled the hatred burning in her son's eyes. And now, there was nothing left for her to do. Nothing but watch, nothing but cry, nothing but witness the last fragile thread tying her sons together snap under the weight of the past. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, the wind carried the remnants of destruction. Debris floated in the air, and the ground was still charged with residual energy. Izuku slowly walked away from what remained of his brother. His movements were steady and unwavering, but his expression held an eerie calm, a stark contrast to the sorrow that had once consumed him. For a moment, he stood there, letting the night breeze brush against his face, cooling the heat still radiating from his body. Then, without looking away from the horizon, he spoke. "It's time, Toga." Toga nodded and took the syringe containing Reiju's blood. She injected it into her arm, and for a brief instant, her hair and pupils shifted to match Reiju's. But within seconds, she returned to normal. Izuku extended the other syringe, the one filled with the glowing green liquid. This is going to hurt. Toga smiled and took the syringe without hesitation. Without a second thought, she plunged the needle into her neck, and the moment the liquid surged into her bloodstream, a blood-curdling scream tore from her throat as she collapsed to her knees. Brilliant yellow lightning erupted from her body, illuminating everything around them. "Toga!" Izuku shouted, immediately kneeling beside her and pulling her into his arms, holding her tightly. "Breathe. Just breathe, love. I'm right here with you." Toga was gasping, her body convulsing uncontrollably. Her fingers clawed at the ground as waves of unbearable power surged through her. But Izuku held her firmly, his hands moving gently along her back in a soothing motion. "Look at me. Don't take your eyes off me. Don't you dare leave me. You promised we'd be together until the end. Are you going to break your promise?" Izuku said, his voice trembling with fear. The thought of her being unable to withstand one for all terrified him, but his words reached Toga. Deep within her, she saw 9 lights, echoes of the previous one for all wielders. "I won't be defeated, least of all by you," she shouted as she began to claim the quirk as her own. Slowly, her screams faded. Her breathing steadied, and her eyes opened. Her crimson pupils shimmered with streaks of yellow lightning before transforming into a glowing scarlet hue. Toga rose to her feet slowly, her hair flowing with the electricity crackling from her body. She extended her hand, and a cascade of red lightning danced between her fingers. "This," she whispered, a dangerous smile curling her lips. "This feels amazing." Izuku smirked and gently took her hand, noticing the faint red glow pulsing through Toga's body. Their fingers intertwined, and he felt the warmth radiating from her, even through the blood and sweat covering her skin. "Then let's put it to the test." Toga let out a soft laugh, her golden eyes gleaming with a mix of madness and adrenaline. "Ready to become a legend?" Izuku narrowed his eyes, the smile on his lips turning dark. "We already are." Without warning, they vanished in a flash of red and white lightning. The city trembled beneath them as the shockwave of their power shattered the foundations of buildings, though they only tore through those already left in ruins by Reiju's reckless destruction. Alarms blared in the distance, but neither of them hesitated. Heroes arrived armed with their best weapons and strategies, many eager to prove themselves, but Izuku and Toga responded only with fire, blood, and devastation. If they were attacked, they retaliated with even greater brutality. The media branded them a global threat, not just to Japan but to the entire world. The headlines called them the blood-stained duo, world-class villains, ruthless and merciless. But only Izuku and Toga knew the truth. They were hunting the worst of the worst, the ones who corrupted the world from the shadows. Yes, blood was inevitable, but they were only cleaning up the chaos the heroes were too afraid to touch. Now, in the present, Izuku was breathing heavily, leaning against a pile of rubble in the middle of a crater that stretched for hundreds of meters around him. The ground was fractured, the rocks scorched by the unleashed power. Beside him, Toga was gasping, dark blood dripping from the corner of her lips. Both were covered in cuts, bruises, and ash. "Damn." Toga smiled, her eyes half-lidded. "I didn't think we'd end up like this." Izuku dragged himself toward her, using a bloodied hand for support. The pain in his body was unbearable, his legs weren't responding, or maybe they were no longer there, and warm blood soaked his side. But none of it mattered when he saw the gaping wound in Toga's chest that refused to heal. "Toga." His voice was low, almost a whisper. "Hold on, please." She looked at him with a calm expression. "Does it look that bad?" Izuku forced a weak smile. "Nothing a good Netflix session can't fix." Toga laughed, but the sound was cut short by a sudden cough. Dark blood dripped from her lips, yet she still managed a faint smile. "Can we watch a show later?" Izuku lay down beside her, wrapping her in the only arm he had left. His other hand, or what was left of it, had been torn away by the final attack of a heroine before he reduced her to ashes with a burst of fire. But at that moment, the physical pain was meaningless. "Of course," he murmured, pressing his forehead against hers. "We can watch whatever you want." "That sounds perfect." Toga closed her eyes for a moment, her breathing was shallow and unsteady. "Although, I don't know if I'll be able to make popcorn. I can't feel my hands." Izuku let out a choked laugh. He didn't want to tell her that she no longer had hands. "Don't worry. You always burn the popcorn anyway." Toga giggled sweetly, though each breath came with more difficulty. Izuku felt a chill crawl down his spine as he noticed how pale she had become. "If I'm born again," Toga whispered, her voice trembling, "will you look for me?" Izuku squeezed his eyes shut, his hand trembling as he caressed her cheek. "Of course, I will." His voice cracked. "But if I get lost? Make a big sign for me." Toga smiled weakly. "I'll make one. Really big." Izuku felt the weight in his chest grow unbearable. His breathing quickened as Toga's grew weaker. Her skin was ice cold. "Don't fall asleep, Toga," he murmured. "Stay with me. Just a little longer." Toga slowly opened her eyes, her crimson gaze looking at him with warmth. "I'm so tired. Izuku. I want to sleep." "No, don't close your eyes. Not now." Izuku felt his voice break. "Toga." She tried to say something, but her voice was barely a whisper. "I love you." Izuku watched as the light in her eyes began to fade, the last spark of life slipping away in his hands. With her final breath, Toga gave him a faint smile, her lips trembling as she spoke the words that would tear his soul apart. "Happy Valentine's Day. Darling." And then, everything went black. Izuku felt his chest shatter into 1,000 pieces, his heart stopping along with hers. "Toga. Toga, stay with me, please." But there was no response. A final breath escaped her lips, and her body became completely still in his arms, cold, silent, as if the world itself had come to a halt. "No." Izuku's scream was heart-wrenching, a cry so agonizing it felt as if it could tear the world apart. Watching her die, he felt something inside him break, as if his very existence had lost all meaning. He held her tighter, as if clinging to her essence, as if his embrace alone could bring back her warmth, her life. But her body remained cold, unmoving, and each passing second felt like an eternal hell. His tears fell uncontrollably, soaking Toga's lifeless face. In the distance, the sound of helicopters echoed in the air, but to him, it was nothing more than a distant noise in a world that no longer mattered. Without her, there was no reason to keep fighting. "I'll find you, Toga, I swear," he whispered, his voice broken, drowned in grief. "I'll find you, and this time, we'll have our happy ending." A final tear fell onto Toga's pale cheek as Izuku closed his eyes, letting the darkness consume him, surrendering to the abyss alongside her. They were two souls who, despite being devoured by the cruelty of the world, had always been each other's light. And when one faded, the other simply followed. Because that was their promise. Together forever. A promise they had made and would never break. End of the story. Thank you to everyone who watches my videos. I really appreciate the support you give. I hope the translation is correct. If there was any mistake, I apologize. Take care and see you next time.